The teaching that you're about to hear this morning is part of our year-long campaign that we are calling the Year of Biblical Literacy. You can find out more over on our website at midtownbiblicalliteracy.com, and there you can find reading plans, resources, podcast episodes, all in an effort to help us raise our understanding of the Bible. So with that in mind, enjoy this teaching.
All right, yeah, you can have a seat. Well, good morning, everybody. How are you? Yeah, doing good? Good. Glad to hear it. Glad to hear it. If you're a guest, my name's Michael. I'm one of the pastors here. It's a joy and honor, as always, to get to be with you. And today, we come to the fourth and final scene of the story of Ruth. We're going to be in Ruth chapter 4 together, and we're going to cover the whole thing as we sort of close the book on this awesome short story. If you remember back to the beginning of this series, we said that Ruth has been called by some one of the greatest short stories ever written. Because, as we said, the power of a good story isn't just in the details and the action of the story, but often because of the larger stories these little stories connect us to. So, for example, some of us, hypothetically speaking, love Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. Maybe it's just me, a few of us here, I love that. But we love Lord of the Rings and Star Wars because they bring us into the deeper stories of the struggle between good and evil and friendship and fate. We love rom-coms because they tap into that thing within us that longs for connection and love and happiness with another person. We love Godzilla versus Kong because we're Americans and nothing surprises us anymore, I guess. I don't know. For some of us, we love Godzilla versus Kong. But stories, they bring us in, right? Because they connect us to something much bigger than the story itself. And that's true for the stories that our culture tells, as well as the true stories contained in Scripture. And that includes the true story of Ruth. In fact, as we'll see today, in chapter 4, this is something the author doesn't just hope that we see, but something he explicitly shows us. So, as I said before, feel free to grab a Bible and turn to Ruth chapter 4, and that's where we'll pick up. As you get there, what I want to do is I want to remind you of how everything began, because understanding the beginning is going to be important for understanding the ending. So, in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, the whole thing opens up with the writer saying, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land." So these are the words that bring us into the whole story. When we first meet our characters, we're brought into this bigger setting, the time of the judges and famine, a dark and tragic time for God's people. As we said, the story of Israel during this time was summarized, as the author of Judges says, as a time when there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. God's people were essentially this rudderless and leaderless, selfish people suffering all sorts of breakdown as a result. And so the nation of Israel at this point in time is in a bit of chaos. There's no harmony. There's no unity. Everyone is just looking out for themselves. And on top of that, there is a famine. There's a shortage of food and provision. And then the opening pages zoom us in on one particular family at this one particular point in time. Elimelech, Naomi, and their two sons who have fled to Moab, an enemy nation, to escape the consequences of the famine. And there, they're met with disaster. Elimelech and the sons die, leaving behind Naomi with her two Moabite daughters-in-law, one of which leaves Naomi to return to her people, and the other is Ruth, who in a display of radical faith and faithfulness stays with Naomi to follow her and her God to Bethlehem. And the central question was, what is going to happen? What is going to happen to Ruth and Naomi? What would become of their situation? And chapters 2 and 3 answer that. Despite Naomi's belief, God had not abandoned them. In fact, God was there, working behind the scenes the whole time, even when Naomi and Ruth couldn't see it. Ruth meets a man named Boaz, through whose ordinary faithfulness God uses to provide for Naomi and Ruth. And thus, Naomi's hope is sort of reignited. She sees that their story might not be at an end after all, and it culminates in a clandestine meeting that she orchestrates between Ruth and Boaz, where Ruth does the unimaginable and proposes marriage to Boaz, because he could be what is called their kinsman redeemer, a concept in Hebrew culture whereby a male relative had the opportunity to act for a family member in need, in this case, through something called levirate marriage, where he would marry and father children for the long-term safety and provision of the family. And in this climactic moment of tension for the whole story, Ruth comes to Boaz and she says, will you be this for me? Will you redeem me? Will you redeem our family? And if you were here last week, you know that Boaz says yes, that he would do it. But there was a slight hiccup. There was another relative who was closer. And essentially that meant that he had the first right, or dibs, so to speak, for redemption. But Boaz promises, whether it's him or whether it's me, it's going to be done this very day. And what we find out is that Boaz has a little bit of a plan of his own. And that's where we pick up in chapter 4. Let's look at verse 1. And now Boaz had gone to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. So a little bit of context. The gate in the ancient Near East was the place in town where you went to conduct legal affairs and business transactions. It was sort of like an ancient combo of a town hall and a courthouse. And it was also the easiest place to find someone in the city because it was basically one way in and one way out. And so Boaz does exactly what he said he was going to do. He goes there and he waits for the man to come by and then invites him to sit down and have a chat. Verse 2. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. And for what it's worth here, don't think like church elders or anything like that, or don't think like this is some sort of like ancient intervention situation. That's not what's going on. He brings these guys over to essentially be legal witnesses to what's about to happen, so that there's some public testimony to this transaction. And what it really shows us is that Boaz is making sure to do things by the book. No back alley deals, no cutting corners, or anything like that. Verse 3. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. So we're not 100% sure where this land came from. It or the legal right to use it may have been sold by Elimelech to buy food during the famine or before leaving for Moab. Or Naomi may still be in full possession of the land or its use of it, and now she's selling it out of necessity. But in either case, due to their destitute situation, it's up for redemption. So it's up to a redeemer to redeem it. And for what it's worth, introducing this way is a pretty slick move by Boaz, all right? For Mr. So-and-so or whoever he is, this is a pretty enticing offer. After all, as the saying goes, there's one thing we ain't making any more of, right? Dirt, land, real estate. And owning land then was every bit as valuable as owning land is now. And so to Mr. So-and-so's ears, this would be a really appealing offer. He'll have to take care of Naomi, but when she dies, this land will be his because she won't have any heirs to claim it. So the gist of what Boaz is saying is, hey, look, Naomi has this land to sell. It's cheap and a good investment, and you're the first in line to redeem it. Do you want it? This is the good old-fashioned bait and switch, all right? Like, man, Mr. So-and-so bites. He said, I will redeem it, because what thinking person wouldn't? But Boaz, in classic late-night infomercial fashion, goes, but wait, there's more. Verse 5, then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. So essentially, by the way, Mr. So-and-so, one more thing. This piece of land, it comes with a widow named Ruth. And if you're going to be the redeemer here, it's going to mean more than just the land. You would have to marry her too, and then fulfill another role of the kinsman redeemer and father a child so that her husband's lineage could continue, which is not at all what Mr. So-and-so had in mind. Verse 6, then the redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Ruth makes things not so straightforward. At first, the deal was to take care of an old lady and in return, get a field. That's an easy yes. But if it comes with Ruth, if it comes with Ruth involved and then a child, well, that's not that simple or not as simple. And before you write him off as a chump, okay, like let's just think about the cost of it, what it would actually cost him. So first, listen, I'll tell you this much. As a parent, I love the baby stage, okay? I love it. But do you want to know what I love more than the baby stage? Sleep, all right? I love sleep. I love sleep and I love no childcare payments. Amen? I mean, goodness gracious, right? And like I'm telling you what, it would take a lot. All right, we are just now beginning to inch our way out of this as a family, and it would take a lot to convince me to dive headfirst back into all of that once again, okay? Like, it'd just be a very, very hard sell, and I imagine it must be something like that for this guy as well, but for him, it's actually even more than that. It's not just, oh man, I'm gonna have to start everything all over again, but there's like some serious cost to making this decision. To take Ruth in and father another child now adds an obligation onto him to split his inheritance or to split his wealth down even further. And the pool is only so big. Now, look, I'm not a math person. I'm not going to get up here and say that I'm a math person, but the little that I do know about division is that the greater the number you divide by, the less each part gets, right? Like that's how it works. And these are the calculations that Mr. So-and-so is making in his mind. With Ruth involved, he likely wouldn't even get the field in the first place because it would go to Naomi's heir. And then the rest of his wealth might actually take a hit too. It might hit his other kids, the other children who are down the line from it, and his obligation to care for whatever offspring would follow with Ruth. And so Mr. So-and-so concludes, hey, look, that cost is too high for me to pay. So Boaz, if you want to pay it, then by all means, go right ahead. Now, this was the custom, verse 7. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. Apparently, this was like an ancient version of a receipt, like, here's my shoe. We made a purchase. I don't get it. I don't understand it, but whatever. It worked for them. We made a deal. See, I have his Jordans. Cool, whatever. Verse 8. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. So Boaz looks to the elders to do what he brought him there to do, to give public witness to this transaction, to remove the ability of take backsies from Mr. So-and-so in the future. What we see here is Boaz is stepping fully in. More than just a benefactor, he will be the redeemer. He will be the answer to the prayers of Ruth and Naomi. He will step in and provide. He will step in and redeem to care for them. And again, I just love Boaz's character here and throughout this whole story. He is not trying to shy away from the cost, but tells everybody within earshot, I know it's costly, but I'm going to pay it. I'm going to pay it. Here's what I'm going to do. And the people see this and they are absolutely amazed. They're absolutely amazed. At this point, a crowd has begun to gather around. People have seen and heard apparently, oh, someone is considering becoming a redeemer for Ruth, the Moabite. And it's creating quite a stir. And once they see the sacrifice that Boaz is willing to make, they recognize how big of a deal this is and they bless it. Verse 11. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. Now, those words might just sound like words to you, but they're actually pretty marvelous things for the people here to say. In response to this amazing act, the crowd pronounces blessings over Ruth, Boaz, and their family. First, they bless Ruth. They pray that Ruth would be like Rachel and Leah. If you're unfamiliar, Rachel and Leah were the two wives of Jacob. We talked about them a few months ago in our Torah series. They were two of the four matriarchs of Israel, two of the most important women in the history of God's people. It is their 12 sons that became the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. They hold an incredible place of honor in the story of God's people. And the elders and the people of Bethlehem are asking the Lord to make Ruth like them. And lest you forget and miss the significance of this, remember, Ruth is not an Israelite. She is not a natural-born Jew. She is a Moabite, a foreigner. But the people of Bethlehem pray that she, a foreigner, would become as big of a pillar to Israel's story as these others. That this outsider would be and become not just an insider, but an absolute pillar of the people. This is unreal. Secondly, they bless Boaz. They pray that he would be renowned in Bethlehem, that he would become well known for his kindness, his compassion, his integrity, and sacrifice. That hypothetically speaking, perhaps more than 3,000 years later, a small church in a small town in a country that did not exist yet might actually preach from his story about his faithfulness and sacrifice for Ruth. Hypothetically speaking, of course. And lastly, they bless their household, for their house to be like the house of Perez, which this is a long story and we don't have time to get into it, but the short of it is that the lineage of Perez matters greatly to this particular town of Bethlehem. Bethlehem came from Perez's lineage, came from Perez's line. They exist because he existed, okay? Bethlehem exists because Perez existed. They are who they are because of them. He put them on the map, so to speak. And so what they are praying would be true of this family is that their family line and descendants would do likewise. That likewise their descendants would put Bethlehem on the map, that their offspring would be remembered like Perez. And the thing to note in all of these blessings is that the people are praying that their little story of faith and faithfulness would actually wind up being bigger. You see this? They are praying that their little story, what happened with them, would actually wind up being bigger than just their little story of faith and faithfulness. And I'll go ahead and I'll tell you, this is a little something called foreshadowing, because this is exactly what happens. Verse 13, so Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And man, I cannot tell you how much I love this picture. Naomi with this baby in her lap. This woman who started out as old and embittered, the women of the town are now calling blessed. It's amazing. Verse 17. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. And watch this now, because this next part is everything. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David, as in King David. And now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, Ram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. And this is how the story ends. It's the last word. Jesse fathered David. And for what it's worth, to the ancient ears, this is a mic drop moment, okay? I know genealogies, family trees sound weird and strange to us, but they didn't to the ancient audience. In the Old Testament especially, genealogies are often theologically strategic, and Ruth is the only book in the Bible that ends with one, and it is a very, very big one. To give you an image that we might understand, what's happening here in these last verses, this is learning that Bruce Willis was dead in The Sixth Sense the whole time, okay? That's what this is. This is Vader revealing that he's Luke's father, except positive. This is learning that the planet of the apes was just Earth in the very, very distant future the whole time. This is the plot twist. This is the resolution that you never saw coming. This is the moment where you go, hold up. This was about that the whole time? This whole story was about this other thing? You remember how we said this whole thing started, right? In the time of the judges, when there was no king in Israel and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no king and it was a huge problem. That's how it all starts. And then it zooms in on this one little family, and you think the whole time that it's about them, that it's about their plight, their struggle, their pain, only here at the end to have the author go, oh, by the way, that baby that is on the grandmother's lap, it just so happens that's the grandfather of the king. Do you see? The final word of the story explains the point of the whole story. Or rather, it reveals the bigger story behind a little story being told the whole time. The entire time, this story was not just about God providing for one family in need, but providing for a whole nation that was in need. It turns out that God is quite the multitasker, right? He is almost never doing just one thing. While he was working in the lives of one needy family, he was also putting the pieces in place to bring his people the king they needed. It wasn't just about Naomi and Ruth, but it was about David the whole time. David, who would kill Goliath. David, who would unify God's people. David, who would put a little town called Bethlehem on the map. David, who would be called a man after God's own heart. David, who would restore the worship of Yahweh to the nation of Israel. David, who would later receive the promise that God would use his line to continue to deliver on his greater promise to send an anointed one. A seed of Adam, an offspring of Abraham, a lion of Judah, a Messiah, a king of kings who would crush the head of the serpent, bless the nations, and bring the full and final redemption and restoration as far as the curse of sin is found. Do you see this? I mean, this is just so incredibly creative because all along the way, the author was just dropping these little tidbits of God working behind the scenes, even though Ruth and Naomi couldn't see it. These just so happens moments, God was weaving the whole time, only to reveal that the whole story was one of those moments. God doing more behind the scenes than anyone would have thought possible. Do you see why this little story isn't just another little story, but an incredible testimony to a good and faithful God who is writing a much bigger story all around us? It's beautiful. It's amazing. And so here at the end, honestly, I think there's so much that we could glean from what we learn about who God is and what we see him do in the lives of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. But I just want to give us a couple here at the end that I think the conclusion of this story really presses upon us. Things to consider. The first is this, is that when God is involved, very little just so happens. Very little just so happens. In fact, it might be more fair to say that nothing just so happens when God is involved. From start to finish, the author seems intent on making us unequivocally aware of what theologians call the providence of God. Providence is a word from Latin roots that mean on behalf and to see towards something. The way we might say it in English is like when we say, hey, I'll see to it. I'm going to make sure something gets done. I'll see to that. Providence is God's seeing to everything. That's what providence is. Absolutely everything that needs to be done to bring about his purposes. God sees to it that what needs to happen will in fact happen, regardless of whether we're aware of it or not. Providence is the power and care by which he provides, sustains, and governs the world he made and his people within it. And over and over and over again, there's that little wink throughout the story from the author that it just so happened that Ruth found herself at Boaz's field. And it just so happened that Boaz was in his field that day. And it just so happened that this child was going to be the grandfather of King David. And what the conclusion of the story reveals to us is no. Since God was involved, just so happened didn't just happen. There was something he was doing the whole time, both in their lives and on the greater scale. The whole time they were under the providential care of a God who is doing more than they could have ever thought possible. And for what it's worth this morning, I think that ought to provoke some consideration from us about our own circumstances too, shouldn't it? That if God is involved in our lives, then there is very little just so happens to our own stories as well. And for what it's worth, I'm not telling you this to make you get all weird or anything like that. Like, here's what I mean. Like if someone says to you, good luck on your project tomorrow, okay? This is not saying you become the person that goes, well, actually, because God exists, there's no such thing as luck. So I would prefer if you said good providence to me instead. Ew, gross, okay? Don't be that guy. Don't be that guy. Because providentially, that person is never going to talk to you again. You feel what I'm saying? No, don't do that. But I'm telling you this because on some level, it should reframe our perspective about how we think about our lives. It should reframe our perspective on how we think about our own stories and God's involvement in our day to day. For example, 2 Corinthians 1 tells us that the comfort we receive as we go through hardships is given to us by God, that we might be able to help others in their time of need. That part of why you have gone through, whatever it is that you have gone through, is so that you can help others who are going through what you have. It's part of the deal. In Acts 17, Paul makes the case that we exist in a time and place that we do in order that people may find God. I know you thought you ended up in your neighborhood because you wanted more closet space and it was a good deal. I get that. And that might be true, but biblically, it was also because God was multitasking. He was hooking you up with more storage and making a way for the people around you to come to know Jesus, to see the truth of the gospel. This is who he is. This is what he does. And the point is, the things in your life, whatever they may be, are not incidental or accidental when he is involved. And for what it's worth, I would just like that to free some of you up, okay? I would like for the providence of God to free some of you up for a moment, because I know there are so many of us in this room who are riddled with anxiety because we feel like it's all on us. That if we misread the tea leaves, so to speak, that we're going to miss out on what God has for us. But friends, that is not true, because God is a providential God. If you are in Christ, your life is held in the hands of a providential Father who cares for you. And just because you don't see it and you don't feel it, and quite possibly never do, it doesn't mean that it's not there. Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, they had no clue what God was doing. They were just taking life as it came. In fact, they lived and died without ever knowing the full extent of what God was going to do through them. But the whole time, he was working through them in their story to bless those beyond them. And the point is, church, that is true for you as well. You have no idea what the providential God of the universe wants to use you for, wants to do in and through you and your story. You do not know the story he is writing in your present circumstances right now, but he is involved. He is there. And hear me, nothing is wasted. Nothing. And that brings me to the second thing that's related, honestly. Second thing I think we see is the story of Ruth shows us is that at the same time, with God being a providential God, it means we have a complicated relationship with tragedy and pain. We have a complicated relationship with tragedy and pain. I think Naomi's portion of the story particularly highlights this. She experiences terrible tragedy, right? Like, her story begins with her suffering greatly, losing her husband and her 2 sons, returning to Bethlehem poor and destitute, feeling like God is her enemy. All she has, in her words, is a nothing of a daughter-in-law. Like, I can't even imagine what that may have been like for her. She is so crushed, she literally starts referring to herself as bitter old woman. She's empty. She's devastated. And it's awful what she has endured. And yet, somehow, it was also the means by which God brought about the king. It's complicated. It's complicated. And they're the obvious questions, right? Like, Bailey, are you trying to tell me that what happened to Naomi was actually a good thing? No, I am not saying that. It was a tragedy, without question, awful. Well, are you saying we shouldn't feel bad when bad things happen? No, I'm not saying that either. When bad things happen, you should feel bad. You should grieve. If you don't, I'm pretty sure that's close to the definition of a psychopath, okay? So you should feel bad. Well, then are you saying that God did this to Naomi? Was he actually her enemy after all? No, I'm not necessarily saying that either. The Bible presents lots of different reasons why bad things come into our lives. Sometimes, yes, it's because God brings them in because he's doing something we can't see. The prophets talk about this all the time, and we're actually going to study one later this year that exposes that. But sometimes it's the result of our sinful choices or the sinful choices of others. And there are still others that come into our lives that simply happen because the world is just not how it should be, that it's broken. The whole thing is complicated. And I'm not saying any of those things. But what I am saying is at the end of the story here, there is a grandmother with a baby on her lap who is the grandfather of King David. A grandmother who can testify like Paul does in Romans 8:28 that whatever comes our way, and whatever comes our way, there is a God who is working all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. That even in our suffering, as bad as it may be, the providential, loving hands of God are not far away. That even those situations are not beyond his ability to redeem and restore. And man, listen, I know that verse specifically needs to stick in some of our hearts this morning. He does not simply promise that he will turn some things for our good. You see that, right? He doesn't promise that he'll just turn some things for our good, but all things. All things. That with God, there is not one situation, there's not one circumstance, there's not one pain, not one problem, not one struggle that is beyond his ability and intention to redeem. And I try to say this to you this way often, but if he can turn the murder of Jesus into salvation, then don't underestimate what he can do with whatever it is you're going through. Point being, no matter the reason the bad may have come into your life, if you are his, you have the promise that his providence can and will work for your good. That just like he can take the pain in this story and turn it into praise, just like he can take the bitterness and turn it into blessing, he can do the same for you. He can do the same for you. Which is really the main thing that I believe this little story tells us about the bigger one. It's that the God who is behind this story is a God who is forever faithful. He is forever faithful. And Ruth's story just shouts this to us from every single turn. When all hope seems lost, God gives Naomi Ruth. When they don't know where to go or what to do, he brings along Boaz. When they need a redeemer, there is one to redeem. When there was no king, God made a king. On virtually every level of this story, it proclaims that this is who God is and this is who God will be. He is faithful forever. In fact, there's a reason that you and I, thousands of miles and thousands of years removed, know about this little town called Bethlehem. And it has very little to actually do with King David, but rather with another king who was born from this little forgotten corner of the world. When Matthew sat down to record his biography of Jesus' life, he started his account in similar fashion to how Ruth ends, with a family tree. And there in Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, it reads, "And Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of David the king," and then a few more generations until you come to verse 16, "and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Christ." You see, the ending of this little story is meant to push us to look even further down the road at the bigger story that God always intended on writing, to another king who would be born, a king who would come to do what no king before him could actually do, to take away the sins of the world, both mine and yours forever, to make a way for outsiders to become insiders, to give the broken and hurting healing and hope, to wipe away every tear, to give us to give us a hope and a future where one day every single bad thing, even death itself, will be swallowed up and undone. Jesus who would pay the ultimate price for our redemption by offering his life on the cross for us to make us his own. For the Christian, this is what the story is really about. Ruth shows us how from a long time ago, nothing was just so happening in God's story. He was always making a way to meet our deepest need. And in this way, I find that Ruth is an incredible prelude to what we will celebrate next week, Easter, Resurrection Sunday. Next week, we are going to celebrate that this Jesus came, died, and rose again, that our sin, our suffering, our pain will not be the final story. But because the tomb is empty, we can know with confidence that our God is in fact working all things out for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And next week, we're going to baptize new believers that in a similar way to Ruth would enable us to zoom in, to see the individual stories of God's providence and faithfulness in individual lives as they get baptized and proclaim faith in Jesus, and to zoom out, to see that his grand plan of salvation and rescue, to redeem people from every corner of the globe, is still going. It's the story he's still writing. He's still doing it. He's still working all the time, all around us, male, female, young, old, outsiders to insiders. But for today, we're going to end as we do each Sunday. We're going to take a meal together to remember the ultimate expression of God's faithfulness to us. The death of Jesus, his body and blood broken and spilled for us to give us this hope, to give us this future, to bring the providence of God down home into each and every one of our lives. So let's pray.